Hi there, my name is Oliver. Tonight I will be reading chapters 10 and 11 from The Sword and the Chain, the second book of the trilogy, Guardians of the Flame, The Warriors. In these chapters, we pick up with Karl, Ahira, and the freed slaves just after their visit to Baron Furnael. Will Ger's plan to have his son trained by Karl work, or will it be a distraction that spells disaster? Will they make it safe to Melawei? Or will Ahrmin's magic compass lead to a confrontation before they can? Let's find out. Part 4. Melawei. Chapter 10. To Evanor. Practice is the best teacher. Publilius Syrus. As they rode down the shallow slope toward Evanor, the freshwater sea called the Sirik lay below them and ahead of them, rippling off across the horizon. Off in the distance, Karl could see the rainbow sails of a wide-beamed sloop, tacking in toward the harbor. 10, perhaps 12 small ships huddled around Evanor's docks, as seamen bustled like ants to load and unload their cargo. Just harbor side of the breakwater, 3 large ships lay at anchor, attended by half a dozen small launches that swarmed around them like pilotfish around a shark. The low stone buildings of Evanor cupped the harbor, flat and ugly. The streets were narrow, crooked, and strewn with refuse. The town of Evanor looked like one large slum. There was only one exception. A cylindrical building, seemingly 3 or 4 stories high, stood in the center of town like a rose on a pile of dung. It shone whitely. Karl rubbed his eyes. It was hard to make out the details of that building. The edges and details fuzzed in his eyes, as though he couldn't focus on it. Ahira? The dwarf shook his head. It doesn't seem to suit my eyes, either. You think that's the ferry holding, or embassy, or whatever they call it? The dwarf snorted. The snort was immediately echoed by his pony. Not likely to be anything else. I doubt the locals build out of mist and light. Karl nodded. I'd like to know how they do that. Ever hear of magic? Ahira fell silent. After a reflexive check to see that the others, riding behind him, were doing fine, Karl patted at Carrot's neck. I wonder how you're going to take to being on a ship. Did horses get seasick? And how about the others? Chak, Tenedy, and Raf had never been on a boat before. Fjolt wouldn't be a problem. He was a Salke, and apparently everyone on Salket spent a good deal of time at sea. Ahira wouldn't be a problem, fortunately. A vomiting dwarf wouldn't be any fun to be around. And Ea was a Mel. According to Chak, everyone in Melawei was practically conceived at sea. Well, at worst, we're going to have 4 upchuckers among us, probably including me. Karl rubbed at his belly. Maybe this time will be different. God, please let this time be different. His only other time at sea had been on the Gannis's Pride. The trip from Lundale to Pandathway on the Pride was not one of Karl's fondest memories. He had spent the first few minutes throwing up his breakfast, the next couple of hours vomiting up food he didn't even remember swallowing, and most of the rest of the trip with the dry heaves. Ahira chuckled. What is it? Karl looked down at the dwarf. You think seasickness is funny? The dwarf shook his head. No, I wasn't thinking about seasickness at all. Oh, so it's my nervousness about going on a boat again that's funny. Ahira scowled. Your nervousness? Karl, you don't know what nervousness about being on a boat is. That was strange. Ahira hadn't shown a trace of nausea while they'd been aboard the Gannis's Pride. Iron Guts Ahira, that's what we'll have to call you. You hid your seasickness well. No, I wasn't seasick. There are other problems than seasickness, the dwarf said, scowling. Think it through, Karl. Well? How much do you weigh? Huh? What did that have to do with anything? A simple question, actually. How much do you weigh? About 220 or so? On this side. Back home, about... How much do I weigh? About the same, I'd guess. A dwarf was built differently than a human. Ahira's body wasn't just shorter and disproportionately wider than Karl's. His muscles and bones were more dense. More dense. Oh, I hadn't thought about that. A human's body was, overall, less dense than water. But the dwarf... If you fell overboard, you'd sink like a stone, chainmail vest or no. Exactly. I could easily drown in 5 or 6 feet of water. A bit more serious than a spot of projectile vomiting, no? But what was so funny about that? Ahira smiled. You were the one thinking about boats. I was thinking about towns. Well, think about it. What was the first town we ever dealt with on this side? Lundale. We just barely got out of there with our lives. Not all of them had gotten out alive. Jason Parker had died in Lundale, spending the last few moments of his life kicking on the end of a spear. Someday, if I can find the time, I think I'll look up Lordling Lund and feed him his fingers, one joint at a time. Exactly. We left Lundale just about 10 seconds ahead of the posse. The next town was Pandathaway. We got out of there a couple days before Ahrmin left, chasing us. We didn't spend any time worth talking about in a town until you and Walter went into Matrail. And look at the time frame there. From the time you killed Lord Mellon's Ahrmin until Matrail found out must have been at least a week, maybe a 10-day. The dwarf held out a stubby finger. 1, 10 seconds. Another finger. 2, 3 days. A third finger. 3, a full week. Ahira shot a glance at Karl. Now think about the BM and Furnael. For once, we left the town without anybody after us, even though the Baron wasn't pleased about your turning down that job. I was a bit nervous about that for a couple of weeks, but now that we're almost in Evanor, it's clear that he's not coming after us. So? Karl didn't see the point of it all. So, it seems to me that it's a sort of progression. Looks like we're learning to get along better and better with the locals. If this keeps up, eventually we might even make friends somewhere, be invited to stay. If this keeps up. Well, yonder, I'm starting to like saying yonder, lies Evanor. All we have to do there, all we want to do there, is book passage to Melawei. Do you always have to belabor the obvious before you try and ask me a favor? Karl couldn't help returning Ahira's smile. Try just asking. Fair enough. While we're in Evanor, try to avoid sticking any locals through the gizzard. Karl shuddered. You're talking as though I like bloodshed. He opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. Keep it light. Just keep it light. That's asking a lot. What'll you do for me? Ahira thought about it for a minute. Ever hear of positive and negative reinforcement? Of course. Used to be a psych major. Good. Let's use both. Negative reinforcement. If you get us into trouble here, I'll bash you with my axe. And the positive reinforcement? If we do get out of Evanor without any bloodshed, I'll give you a lollipop. Fair enough? Fair enough. Karl chuckled a moment, then sobered. Even though it was hidden by the banter, Ahira was serious. And he had a point. If they ran into slavers in Evanor, the city wasn't the place to take them on. The locals wouldn't like it. Karl had no illusions about his group's ability to take on a slaver team and a large detachment of local armsmen. Though the group was shaping up nicely, come to think of it. Tenedy was getting better and better with a sword. She didn't have the upper body strength to parry more than a few solid thrusts without tiring, but she did have an almost instinctive feel for the weak points in an opponent's defenses. Roth was coming along well, although he didn't seem to have Tenedy's natural bent for swordplay. The boy had to work at it, but he did work hard. A good kid, although the way Roth hung on Karl's every word was quickly getting tiresome. Fjalt's swordsmanship was still lousy, but his hand-to-hand skills had come a long way, and he had developed nice feel for both Manriki Gusari and staff. Chalk was a good man. Not a fancy swordsman, but a reliable one. With Chalk on watch, Karl could sleep peacefully. With Chalk bringing up the rear of the group, Karl could concentrate on what lay ahead, with only an occasional glance behind. Chak was solid, that was it. Even little Aya's bowmanship was coming along. She wasn't as good as Ahira had told Furnael, of course, but not too bad either. Aya and a cocked crossbow could be a nice hole card in a fight.
Wait a minute.
Ahira. Yes? I've got one question, though, if you don't mind. Well? Where are you going to get the lollipop? Chapter 11. Evanor. Remember that no man loses other life than that which he lives, or lives any other life than that which he loses. Marcus Aurelius.
Him?
Karl started. The aging, wide-bellied ketch tied at the end of the narrow dock didn't look familiar, but the man in the sailcloth tunic, directing the loading crew, did. Aver Gannis, what the hell are you doing here? And if you're here, where's the pride? It had to be him. While sweat-stained sailcloth tunics weren't at all rare around the docks, there couldn't be a whole lot of short, dark-skinned sailors with waist-length pigtails and thick, hairy legs, who carried themselves with the rolling swagger and easy confidence of a ship's captain. Captain Gannis? Aver Gannis shouted a quick command at a seaman, then turned. His swarthy face paled. You? Not again. He opened his mouth to call to one of the bowmen at the foot of the dock, then pursed his lips and shrugged, beckoning to a crewman. Quickly, he said. Finish loading and prepare to cast off. But we don't sail until... Smartly now. We may not have to, but I want to be able to cast off and up sails in half a score of heartbeats. We may need to show Evanor a fast set of heels. Understood? Aye, sir. The sailor shrugged and vaulted over the splintered railing, calling out to crewmen to halt the loading process and prepare for casting off. Gannis turned back to Karl, a tragic smile spreading over his face. What is it now, Karl Cullinane? He spread his hands. If you've managed to get Evan as angry as you did Lord Lund, I'd at least like to know why I'm going to die on this wretched dock. Karl raised a hand. I'm not wanted here. Pandathaway, yes. But I understand that Evanor isn't interested. As Chak explained it, there was no love lost between Pandathaway, the center of trade, culture, and magic of the Aran regions, and Evanor, dominated by the outpost of Ferry. Gannis nodded, conceding the point. True enough, as far as official Evanor goes. But not all Evanor is official Evanor. He pointed a blunt finger shoreward. At his motion, a group of filthy, rag-clad men scurried for the shadow of a warehouse, all the while gibbering at each other in strained, high-pitched voices. Watch your back, Karl Cullinane. Being around Ferry too long does strange things to some humans. Drives them crazy. I don't keep bowmen at the foot of the dock for the pleasure of it. In the past, crazies have fired boats, with themselves aboard, more often than not. Some of them would slit you open throat to crotch just for the fun of it. Gannis smiled, instead of for the money. Karl rested his hand on his sword hilt. Perhaps you'd like the money. Gannis sneered. Me? He spat on the dock. Of course. But while the notion of carrying your head back to Pandathaway thrills me, the idea of becoming a side attraction in the Colosseum doesn't. I don't dare set foot in Pandathaway or Lundale, not any more. Not since I was fool enough to carry you from Lundale to Pandathaway. The wizards have long memories. I won't have any further dealings with them for as long as I live. He laughed ruefully, and that's a safe claim, come to think of it. Now, he said, drawing himself up straight, what are you doing here? I'd heard that a ship called the Warthog was leaving for Melawei tonight. Is this it? Yes, and she's mine, such as she is. Karl looked the ketch over, from the gashed bow all the way to the stern, where a pair of seamen worked a bilge pump, sending a constant stream of brown water over the side and into the harbor. Not quite the Gannis's pride, eh? Not quite. What happened? Lund wasn't pleased with my carrying you from Lundale. He hired himself a brace of pirate ships to hunt her down. They caught up with me just off of Selket. The pride went down. I barely escaped with my life. All thanks to you. Gannis sighed. But you haven't answered my question. I think I have. I need to buy some passages to Melawei. 7 people and 2 horses going. 6 and 2 coming back. Are you willing to carry us?
The same you were with before? Gannis brightened. Including Doria?
No, the only one you'd know is Ahira, the dwarf.
Too bad.
Gannis pursed his lips.
I may regret asking this, but are any of the others good with a sword or bow?
All of us. You might be able to use an extra sword or 2. There's been a bit of trouble on the Sirik, I hear.
That was a bald lie. Karl hadn't heard anything of the sort. But, given that slavers were raiding Melawei, it was reasonable to assume that they might pounce on a few merchantmen. And if Gannis was even considering carrying them, it was certain that the captain was afraid of just that. True enough. Gannis stood silently for a moment. Are you sure that you're not wanted here? I'm not about to let you close another port to me. Karl patted the hilt of his saber.
I'm certain. I'll swear it on this, if you'd like.
Gannis nodded. Fine then. I can put the horses in the hold, but the only other accommodations I've got are deck passage. Unless you'd prefer to sleep with your animals.
No thanks.
Very well then. It'll be 6 gold for each human, 5 for the dwarf, 2 for each horse. Each passage, each way. Payable now. He held out his hand.
Karl raised an eyebrow. On this? That's almost 10 platinum. I could almost buy this ship for that.
No, you couldn't. I wouldn't sell. He smiled. Besides, Warthog is faster than she looks. In some ways, she's better than the Pride was. Karl held back a laugh. The Gannis's Pride had been a lean, shapely sloop, not a floating leak. The only way this scow was better than Gannis's former ship was that it would hurt Gannis less to lose her.
Well, at least she's here.
One hand on his hip, Gannis held out a palm. The coin, if you please. Karl hefted the pouch.
I don't have that much with me.
But should they take passage on Gannis's ship? Maybe it would be better to wait for the next one. No. It could be a long time before another Melawei-bound ship left. And if he turned Gannis down, the captain might be tempted to let it be known there was a wanted man around, for whose head Pandathaway would pay well. The threat was implicit in Gannis's ridiculously high price for passage. Karl opened the pouch and counted out 6 gold coins.
You can have this as a deposit. I'll have the rest for you at the time we sail.
Agreed, and I will see you then. Karl started to turn away, but Gannis's shout stopped him. Aren't you forgetting something? Gannis asked.
What?
The captain gestured to Karl's sword. I think there's still a bit of swearing to be done. On your sword, if you please. If, that is, you do want passage. Karl hesitated. Truly, Gannis went on, she is a good ship. Seaworthy and fast.
Of course.
Slowly, Karl drew his sword, then balanced it on his palms. I may as well get this over with. Next thing I know, he'll be telling me she made the Kessel run in 3 parsecs. Ahrmin clung to one of 10 rope ladders secured to the dock, restraining a shiver. The Sirik was cold this late at night, but it and the darkness provided good cover for Ahrmin and his 10 men. He had spent several hours considering how many of the 40 men from the Scourge to take with him. Too small a group wouldn't be able to take on Cullinane and his friends. Too large a group would be impossible to hide. The element of surprise was always a huge advantage, and Ahrmin believed in having every advantage possible. 10 seemed about right. Enough to overpower Cullinane's group, not too many to hide. It would take sharp eyes to see their heads and the few inches of rope that had been tacked on the side of the dock. The dock was a thick and sturdy one, rising more than 2 heads' height above the smooth black water. Near the ship, sandals slapped against wood, and voices called out orders as the crew made the final preparations for the Warthog to sail. Clinging to the ladder next to Ahrmin's, Geral nudged him. "Shouldn't you check that ball again?" he whispered. "Or are you afraid of losing it?" Geral shook his head to clear the water from his eyes and his long, pointed ears. Ahrmin rewarded him with a scowl. The damned elf was more trouble than he was worth. Geral had been a journeyman slaver for more than 20 years, and made no secret of his strong distaste for Ahrmin's promotion to master. Not that Guildmaster Urin had any choice. He couldn't place Ahrmin in authority over senior journeymen without promoting him, and this job was clearly too much for Ahrmin and a group of junior journeymen and apprentices. Probably Geral and the others could have taken that, but the Guildmaster had gone further, taking the unusual step of expressing his confidence in Ahrmin in the writ of mastery, by way of trying to avoid any conflicts. Normally that would have settled the matter. Guildmaster Urin was known for being stinting in his praise. It hadn't settled it. In fact, Urin's strategy had backfired, acting as fuel to the journeyman's resentment, Geral's in particular. "We could have just waited for them at sea," Geral went on, "instead of floating here like a bunch of silkies." "Be quiet. Do you want them to hear us?" That suggestion was ridiculous. It just couldn't work. In a sea battle, it would be impossible to capture Karl Cullinane alive. Stealth was the only chance. But Geral's first idea did make sense. Grudgingly, Ahrmin reached over to the inflated pig bladder that was tied loosely to the ladder, and reached underneath, pulling on the slim rope to haul up the fine mesh net bag containing the device Wenthal had given him. "Light," he whispered. Geral drew his knife, cupping his hands around the blade to prevent the bright glow from shining through the cracks in the dock. Thyron, the Scourge's wizard, had refused Ahrmin's request to help them catch Karl Cullinane, saying that he had signed on only to neutralize the Mel wizards during the slaving raid. But he had agreed to glow a knife, in return for Ahrmin's promise of share of the reward. The finger floated in the yellow oil, pointing unerringly toward the city, toward Karl Cullinane. Ahrmin waited, watching the finger. With agonizing slowness it moved, until it came to rest parallel to the dock. Silently, Ahrmin pushed himself away from the ladder, pulling the bladder with him, beckoning at Geral to follow. Like a compass needle, the finger swung. Karl Cullinane was nearing the dock. He was somewhere in the shadows of Evanor, somewhere near. "He's almost here." Ahrmin tugged on the netting to make certain that it still secured the ball, then checked the rope fastening the netting to the bladder. The knots were still tight. He let the ball sink below the surface, then beckoned to the others bobbing in the dark water. "On my signal, we move," he whispered. "Remember, we can kill the others, but I want Karl Cullinane alive. And Geral, put that knife away." "For a moment," Geral smiled. "For a moment." At the foot of the dock, Karl held up a hand and climbed down from Carrot's saddle. "Rav, has Pirate ever been on a boat before?" The boy shook his head. "No." The white horse snorted and stamped her feet, pulling back against the reins as Raff tried to lead her. He stroked at the horse's neck with his right hand as he held the reins in his left. "And she's getting a bit skittish. I'm sorry, Karl." "Don't apologize, Raff. You do just fine with the horses." Raff drew himself up straight, standing proudly. Karl suppressed a pleased chuckle. A few words of mild commendation did wonders for the boy's posture. Whatever his virtues, Baron Furnael had clearly never been unstinting in his praise. Karl tried to calm Pirate down, but the horse snorted and snapped at his fingers. It was just as well that they had sold the other horses, instead of trying to bring them on board. While Carrot wasn't a problem, Pirate's skittishness could quickly have become contagious. Chak tapped Karl's shoulder. "Let me try." "Go ahead." The little man reached into his sack and produced a strip of cloth. With a quick motion, he whipped it around Pirate's eyes, fastening it in place as a blindfold. The blindfold worked. Pirate calmed instantly, as though someone had thrown a switch. Fjaalt hoisted his bag to his shoulder. "You should keep the horses toward the middle. Gives you a bit of room for error if the animal gets twitchy." Tenedy threw an arm around Fjalt's waist. She smiled. "I guess you are good for something, clumsy. Something else, that is." Ahira raised an eyebrow. Karl shook his head. Something else? Apparently both of them had missed what had been going on between Fjaalt and Tenedy. "Can't put the two of them on watch together anymore," Karl whispered. "They'll be paying too much attention to each other to keep a proper lookout." That's probably been going on for a while. Happens. Ahira nodded. But don't be too critical, eh? Let he without sin cast the first stone and all that. Right. Karl raised his head. Let's go. Slowly now. As he led Carrot onto the deck, Ea skipped ahead, her little feet flying across the wood. She stopped just a few yards from the warthog, nervously eyeing the strangers on board the ship. Gannis held out a hand. Welcome aboard. He raised his head and called out, You have the coin? As agreed, Karl called back. Go ahead, Ea. Get on. We'll be there in a moment. After the slightest of pauses, she walked up the ramp and onto the deck. Karl pulled on Carrot's reins. Easy, girl. It'll just be another... A hand reached out of the water and fastened itself on Karl's ankle. Another hand stabbed a glowing knife into his calf. Pain cut through him. He fell, landing hard on his side, his left arm caught beneath him. A shrill scream forced its way through his lips. Swords and knives in their hands, 11 men slipped out of the water, surrounding them all in a circle of steel points and edges. Karl reached for the hilt of his sword, but the same glowing knife stabbed through his right wrist, pinning his hand to the wood. His fingers writhed, his nails clawed at the wood. Another hand grasped his hair. Don't try to move. An elf's thin face leered inches from his. That will only make it hurt more. We only want Karl Cullinane, a low voice rasped. The rest of you can go, or die. Karl couldn't move his head, and the reflexive twitching of his right hand sent red-hot currents of pain shooting through his arm. He could only see Carrot's rump, Fjaalt, Tenedy, and 2 swords, just at the edge of his vision, menacing them. Fjaalt raised his hands. We don't want any trouble. He slapped at Carrot's hindquarters, sending the horse galloping down the pier. He snatched the Manriki Gusari from his belt, then leapt out of Karl's vision. Fjaalt staggered back, blood fountaining from between his hands as he clutched at his chest, while Carrot's pounding hooves set the dock shaking. Jack! Ahira shouted. Now! Karl struggled to free his left arm as the elf's fist pounded against his face. Blood filled Karl's eyes. Blindly flailing his arm, he managed to fasten his left hand on the elf's throat. Karl squeezed, ignoring the pain, ignoring the clatter of steel and splashes of bodies falling in the water. The only thing that mattered was his left hand and his grip on the elf's throat. Karl squeezed. The blows grew more frantic. Karl squeezed. The flesh of the elf's neck parted beneath his fingers, bathing his arm in blood. The blows eased, then stopped. You can let go of him now, Ahira said, bending over him. He's dead, and the rest are gone. A sudden stab of pain, and the knife was wrenched from Karl's hand. Raf, the healing drafts. Quickly now. Karl shook his head, clearing some of the blood from his eyes. No. Pain pounded redly in his hand and calf, making each word a hideous labor. First, get on board. All of us. Take off, then... The dwarf pulled him up, helping Karl balance on his good leg. The dock was slippery with blood. 3 bodies lay face down on the wood. Tenedy knelt in a pool of Fjalt's blood. Her fists drummed a rapid tattoo on his back. You idiot! She trilled. Never were any good against a sword, never! She beat against his back as though trying to pound him back to life, tears streaming down her face. Chalk sheathed his sword and grasped her hands in his. There's nothing more you can do for him, he said gently. We have to go. He pulled her to his feet, then stopped to pick up Fjalt's body and threw it over his shoulder. Gannis ran over, 2 bowmen at his side. His face was ashen, his lips white. I thought you said... Ralph reached over and grabbed the front of Gannis's tunic. You heard, Karl. Just shut up. We'd better get out of here. They may come back. But... Ralph raised his bloody sword. Shut up! Karl tried to listen, tried to keep his eyes open, but the darkness reached out and claimed him. It was a long swim back up to the light. The water rocked him, and tried to force itself into his mouth. He gave up and let himself sink into the darkness, but a hand reached out and grasped his face, pulling him to the light. Karl, Ahira said, forcing more of the sickly sweet liquid between his lips. We're safe now, for the time being. Karl opened his eyes. He was lying on a narrow bunk, sunlight streaming through the oversized porthole and splashing onto his chest. The ship was canted, sailing close to the wind.
Where?
He struggled to get the words out.
Where are we?
Gennes's cabin. The dwarf smiled. Gennes started to object when we brought you down here, but he took one look at Raf and changed his mind. That's one loyal apprentice, Karl. Good kid. Karl nodded. He brought his right hand up in front of his face. The wound from the knife was just a pinkish scar on the back of his hand, mirrored on his palm. As he stared at the scar, it continued to fade. Soon it would be gone. It would be just as if nothing at all had... No.
Fjalt.
The dwarf shook his head.
Nothing we could do for him. Healing drafts can't help a dead man. But Chak brought the body on board.
He bit his lip.
I thought you'd want to say the words over him, before we bury him in the Sirik. Tenety says that's the way they do it on Salket.
Karl raised himself on an elbow.
I'd better go see to every...
The dwarf planted a hand on Karl's chest and pushed him back.
Everybody else is fine. I've put Raf and Chak on watch. The horses are safe in the hold.
A crooked smile played across Ahira's lips. Although I'd better bring Ea in. She's been crying. Thinks you're dead. Raf and Chak have been telling her you're unkillable, but I don't think she believes them.
I sure as hell don't.
How many of the bounty hunters did we kill? Ahira shrugged. 3 for certain. Another 4 wounded and pushed into the water. The rest dove and disappeared.
And Gennes? How is he taking all of this?
With a weak smile, Ahira picked up his battle axe from where it lay on the floor. I talked to him for a while, and he stopped squawking. He lowered the axe and sighed. But he got away, damn it.
He? Who?
You didn't notice who was leading that group? Karl snorted.
I was sort of busy. What's the mystery?
The leader looked to be about 18. Dark hair and dark eyes. Slim nose. Good with a sword. It took him half a second to spear Fjord through the chest and return to the on-guard position. Had one hell of a familiar-looking and very cruel smile. And that voice. The dwarf shuddered. Didn't he sound like someone we know? Karl tried to remember the voice. No, he had been in too much pain to pay attention. But that description, except for the age, that sounded just like
Ahrmin? But he's dead.
I cut his head off and held it in my hands. There were times that violence bothered Karl, but killing that bastard had been a distinct pleasure. Ahira nodded. But maybe he has either a son or a younger brother who isn't. Karl elbowed the dwarf aside as he pushed himself to his feet. His legs were wobbly, but they would support him.
How would you feel about fixing that?
At our first opportunity. In the meantime,
we bury our dead.
Karl stood at the rail, Raf and Ea next to him. In front of him, Fjalt's body lay shrouded on a plank. The plank was supported at one end by the starboard rail, supported at the other by Tenety, Chak, and Ahira. Karl laid his hand on the rail.
I never knew Fjalt as well as I would have liked to, he said. Guess it's because I never took enough time. But he wasn't an easy man to get to know. Quiet, most of the time. A private person, our Fjalt was. I never really understood why he came along. He didn't seem to have the fire in him that Ahira, Tenety, and I do. And it wasn't a matter of practicing his profession, as it is for Chak, or of learning through doing, as it is for Raf. But that doesn't tell us much about him. What do we really know about this quiet man? We know that he was awkward with a sword and none too good with his hands, although he was learning, and no one ever tried harder. We know that he was a sulky and a sailor, and a farmer and a slave, and finally, a free man. But that was about all. About all.
Karl gripped the rail, his knuckles whitening.
There were only 2 times that I had even a peek through the wall he put up between himself and the rest of the world. It seems to me that Fjolt wouldn't mind my talking about those 2 times, and I hope he'll forgive me, being frank. The first was during a lesson. He had done something well for once. Damned if I can remember what right now. And I'd said something like, "We'll make a warrior of you if you keep this up." He turned to me and shook his head. "Just a man who can protect himself, his friends, and his own. That's all I ask. That's all I ask." The other time was last night. Fjolt must have known that he wasn't good enough to take on a swordsman by himself. He should have waited for a signal from Ahira. But he didn't wait. It didn't make sense, damn it. Karl gripped the body's stiff, cold shoulder. "You should have waited, Fjolt. You should have—" Karl's eyes misted over. His voice started to crack. He took a deep breath and forced his body back under control. "I guess that tells us something important about our friend. Both virtue and flaw. I will miss that virtue, that flaw, and Fjolt, whose body we now surrender to the Cyric." He patted the shoulder and stepped back. Their faces grim, Tenedy, Chalk, and Ahira raised their end of the plank. The body slipped from the plank and splashed into the blue water below, falling behind as it sank. Chalk drew his falchion and raised it to his forehead in salute. Ahira unstrapped his battle-axe, mirroring Chalk. Tenedy stared at the ripples, her eyes red, her face blank. Karl drew his own sword and balanced it on his palms. "I promise you this, Fjolt. You will be avenged." He slipped the sword back into its scabbard. "Maybe I'm wrong, but I like to think you'd want it just that way."